In episode 36, titled Discovery versus Validation versus Exploitation, we're going to separate three words that get used interchangeably in casual conversation, but mean very different things in professional testing: finding, confirming, and proving impact safely. Pen Test Plus questions often hinge on this distinction because many answer choices are technically plausible but wrong for the moment in the workflow. If you treat discovery like proof, you will overclaim and waste time, and if you treat exploitation like the default next step, you will increase risk and violate the spirit of safe engagement behavior. The exam is measuring judgment under constraints as much as it is measuring technical awareness, and this is one of the clearest places where judgment shows up. The goal here is to give you a simple mental boundary line between "I think something might be true," "I confirmed it is true," and "I demonstrated what it means," without turning the process into bureaucracy. By the end, you should be able to read a scenario, place it in the correct stage, and choose the smallest appropriate next action. Discovery is identifying possible weaknesses from signals and patterns, and it is fundamentally about suspicion rather than certainty. In discovery, you observe something that looks off, such as an exposed surface, a configuration clue, an inconsistent behavior, or a response pattern that suggests a weakness might exist. Discovery often comes from recon and enumeration outputs, and it is where you form hypotheses, such as, "This endpoint might be misconfigured," or "This access boundary might be inconsistent." The key is that discovery does not require you to change anything or to prove a dramatic outcome. It requires you to notice the signal and articulate the hypothesis. In exam terms, discovery is often the phase implied by prompts that say you notice something, suspect something, or observe a clue that suggests a vulnerability. The best next step at this point is usually to gather a bit more context or to plan a controlled confirmation, not to jump straight to deep action. When you can describe discovery as hypothesis formation, you keep your thinking honest and disciplined. Validation is confirming reality with minimal risk and minimal change, and it is the phase where you turn a suspicion into a defensible statement. The purpose of validation is to answer, "Is this actually true in this environment under these constraints?" using the smallest, safest checks that produce clear evidence. Minimal risk matters because validation is often performed in production or sensitive environments, and the exam rewards choices that respect stability, scope, and permissions. Minimal change matters because you want evidence that reflects the environment's normal behavior, not evidence that was created by your testing side effects. Validation also means you keep data handling disciplined, capturing only what is necessary to support the conclusion and future reporting. In Pen Test Plus scenarios, validation is often the correct phase when a prompt suggests a potential weakness and asks what you should do next to confirm it. When you treat validation as safe confirmation, you avoid the trap of turning every suspicion into an aggressive test. Exploitation is controlled proof of impact, and it should be understood as a deliberate action taken only when justified by objectives, authorization, and risk tolerance. The key word is controlled, because exploitation in a professional context is not an impulse. It is a planned demonstration designed to show what a weakness enables under defined constraints. Exploitation is also about impact, meaning you are demonstrating a meaningful consequence, not merely that a technical condition exists. On the exam, exploitation is often offered as an answer choice because it sounds decisive, but it is only best when the scenario indicates that proof is needed and that the rules of engagement permit that kind of action safely. If you exploit when validation would have been enough, you increase risk and you may violate trust expectations, especially in production. If you exploit without authorization, you cross the ethical boundary that separates testing from wrongdoing. When you can describe exploitation as controlled proof, you choose it only when it fits the purpose and the constraints. Each stage has typical evidence types, and understanding those evidence patterns helps you avoid both underproof and overcollection. Discovery evidence is often observational, such as a response pattern, a visible configuration clue, an exposed route, or a list of services that suggests a weakness might exist. Validation evidence is confirmatory, such as a controlled check that demonstrates the condition reliably under repeatable circumstances without causing unnecessary impact. Exploitation evidence is demonstrative, such as a controlled action that shows the consequence of the weakness in a way that decision-makers can understand, while still collecting minimal data and avoiding unnecessary harm. The exam expects you to collect enough evidence to be credible at each stage, but not to over-collect sensitive information as if the report is a storage vault. That is why evidence discipline is part of professionalism. You gather what proves the point, then stop. When you match evidence type to stage, you avoid both weak claims and reckless collection. Skipping validation creates mistakes, noise, and wasted effort because it replaces evidence with assumption, and assumptions break quickly in real environments. A discovered clue might be a false positive, an edge layer artifact, or a misinterpreted behavior. And without validation, you can chase the wrong path for a long time. Skipping validation also increases noise because you may jump into broader actions to make something happen, generating logs and operational side effects while still not proving the original claim. On Pen Test Plus questions, the wrong answer often jumps from discovery straight to exploitation, and the correct answer inserts a safe confirmation step that reduces uncertainty first. Validation is also where you respect constraints, because the safest path to certainty often involves small, controlled checks rather than large, disruptive ones. When you validate, you also improve reporting quality because you can state what you confirmed rather than what you guessed. Skipping validation is one of the easiest ways to sound confident and still be wrong. Overexploitation increases harm and breaks trust with stakeholders because it turns an assessment into a risk event, even when the intent is good. Exploitation can disrupt systems, expose sensitive data, and trigger monitoring and incident responses, which can create operational costs and reputational strain. If the client's objective was to validate exposure, exploitation may be unnecessary, and unnecessary actions are difficult to defend when something goes wrong. Overexploitation also risks crossing scope boundaries because a deeper proof effort often expands actions beyond what was originally required to demonstrate the risk. The exam wants you to understand that proof should be proportional to the objective and constrained by safety, timing, and permission. Professional trust is built when clients see you making disciplined choices, not when they see you maximizing access for its own sake. When you keep exploitation proportional, you preserve the relationship and protect the environment. Now walk a simple story where discovery suggests a weakness, then validate carefully because this is the workflow pattern Pen Test Plus wants you to internalize. Imagine you observe that a sensitive-looking route appears reachable and responds differently depending on a small change in the request, which suggests a possible access control weakness. That observation is discovery because it is a signal that something might be wrong, not a confirmed conclusion. The next step is validation, where you perform a minimal, controlled check to confirm whether the route is truly accessible under conditions that should be denied, recording the behavior differences carefully without collecting unnecessary data. If the validation confirms the weakness, you can then decide whether exploitation is required, based on the engagement objective and constraints, rather than automatically escalating. If the objective is to demonstrate impact, you might perform a controlled proof step that shows a meaningful consequence, but only to the minimum degree necessary to support the finding. This story illustrates the discipline. See a signal, confirm reality, then prove impact only when justified. Choosing the smallest safe test that increases certainty is the best practical rule from moving from discovery to validation, because it keeps risk and noise low while improving evidence quality. The smallest test is one that changes as little as possible and answers a single focused question, such as, does this route exist? Does this boundary enforce access consistently? Or does this condition occur reliably? Safe means it respects scope, timing, and operational sensitivity, and it avoids actions likely to disrupt service or expose sensitive data unnecessarily. Increasing certainty means the test should reduce ambiguity, not add more outputs that you cannot interpret or that create more questions than they answer. On the exam, the best next step is often the smallest safe confirmation, because it demonstrates process maturity and evidence discipline. This is how you avoid both analysis paralysis and reckless escalation. When you can identify the smallest clarifying test, you can navigate most scenario questions confidently. There are common pitfalls that appear in exam options, such as confusing screenshots with proof or assuming access implies impact. A screenshot can be evidence, but it is not automatically proof of a security weakness unless it clearly shows the condition under valid constraints and can be explained reproducibly. Assuming access implies impact is another pitfall, because having a foothold does not automatically mean you can reach sensitive data or meaningful actions, and impact must be demonstrated carefully and within scope. Another pitfall is treating a single response as definitive proof, especially when proxies, load balancers, or caching can distort behavior. The exam also punishes overclaiming, where a candidate states, "This is compromised," when the evidence supports only, "This appears exposed." The remedy for these pitfalls is confidence labeling, confirmed, likely, and uncertain, paired with stage-appropriate evidence. When you keep pitfalls in mind, you choose answers that strengthen proof instead of inflating claims. Constraints guide behavior at every stage because they define what best means in the scenario, especially around scope, timing, safety, and permissions. Scope tells you what targets and methods are allowed, and violating it is never a best action, even if it would yield dramatic proof. Timing tells you what can be done safely now, such as whether high-impact actions must wait for a maintenance window or must be avoided entirely during a change freeze. Safety tells you whether the environment can tolerate disruption, which often means validation must be low impact and exploitation must be carefully justified. Permissions tell you what you are authorized to do, and lack of explicit permission often means the correct next step is escalation or clarification rather than action. Pen Test Plus questions embed these constraints in small phrases, and missing them is a common reason candidates pick the wrong stage. When you apply constraints first, your stage choice becomes more obvious and your actions become more defensible. Documenting each stage should capture what you saw and what you confirmed, keeping the boundary between observation and proof clear. Discovery documentation should record the signal and the hypothesis, such as the behavior that suggested a weakness, without claiming a conclusion that has not been validated. Validation documentation should record the controlled test, the conditions under which it was performed, and the repeatable evidence that confirms the condition, with minimal data handling and careful wording. Exploitation documentation should record the authorized proof action, the safeguards used, and the demonstrated impact in a way that supports decisions without exposing sensitive content unnecessarily. Across all stages, documentation should include constraints such as scope boundaries, timing conditions, and safety considerations, because those explain why certain actions were or were not taken. This documentation discipline improves reporting quality and protects trust because it shows you acted deliberately and responsibly. In exam terms, the best answers often reflect this clarity by choosing actions that produce defensible evidence rather than vague claims. When you document by stage, your narrative stays coherent. Here is the mini review in one sentence for each stage because you want a quick mental reset under time pressure. Discovery is noticing signals and forming a hypothesis about a possible weakness. Validation is confirming that the weakness is real in this environment using the smallest safe test and minimal evidence. Exploitation is demonstrating impact in a controlled way only when objectives, authorization, and safety make proof necessary. Those sentences are simple, but they prevent most workflow mistakes because they remind you what each stage is for. When you see an answer choice, you can ask which sentence it belongs to and whether the scenario has reached that stage yet. This is one of the fastest ways to eliminate wrong options on Pentest Plus. If you can repeat these sentences, you can classify actions quickly. In this episode, the main lesson is that discovery finds possible weaknesses, validation confirms reality with minimal risk, and exploitation proves impact in a controlled way only when justified. Skipping validation leads to false conclusions and wasted effort, while overexploitation increases harm and undermines stakeholder trust, especially in constrained environments. Evidence should match the stage with observation for discovery, repeatable confirmation for validation, and proportional demonstration for exploitation, always using minimal data handling. Constraints like scope, timing, safety, and permissions determine what stage is appropriate and what the smallest next action should be. Now classify today's examples in your head by taking one thing you observed recently as discovery, one thing you confirmed as validation, and one thing that would count as exploitation only if authorized, because that classification practice builds exam-ready judgment. When you can do that, you will consistently choose the right next step without being seduced by the most dramatic option. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.